I used to believe I had control over my choices, that life unfolded in ways I could predict and shape. That illusion shattered long before I admitted it to myself. It started with small compromises, working late, missing calls, brushing off invitations. Excuses became habits, and habits became something else entirely. I told myself I was simply dedicated, that ambition required sacrifice. But the truth was quieter, more insidious. I wasn't just chasing success. I was running from something I couldn't yet name. And somewhere in that haze of ambition and distraction, Dan appeared, not as a disruption, but as an inevitability. The first time I really noticed him, it wasn't in a boardroom or across a dinner table. It was in a quiet moment between meetings, when the weight of responsibility had momentarily lifted. He made a passing joke, something light, something ordinary, but the way he looked at me afterward lingered. There was recognition in his eyes, a silent understanding that neither of us acknowledged at the time. It wasn't flirtation, not yet, but it was something, a flicker of a match before the fire. Days turned into weeks, and I began to measure time in proximity to him. The moments we were near each other stretched longer, conversations ran deeper, and the air between us felt different. It wasn't just attraction, it was the pull of something unspoken, something waiting. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the work, on the goals we both pursued with relentless ambition. But the more I resisted, the more obvious it became. He wasn't just a presence in my life anymore. He had become a part of it. The first real step was subtle, almost forgettable to anyone else. A touch that lasted a second too long. A glance that carried more weight than it should have. I let it happen, testing the boundaries, waiting for the guilt to stop me. But it never did. Instead, it emboldened me. Each stolen moment, each quiet conversation, felt like a secret I wanted to keep. I convinced myself that as long as we never crossed a line, I wasn't doing anything wrong. But deep down, I knew lines didn't need to be crossed to disappear altogether. Then, one night, the distance between us collapsed entirely. A hotel bar, a late flight, a quiet corner where no one would notice. I could have walked away. I should have. But when he leaned in, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath, I didn't move. I didn't protest. I just let it happen. And in that instant, everything changed. I stretched under the sheets, slowly waking to the comforting presence of someone beside me. For a moment, I felt disoriented, trying to place myself. Then it hit me, and a small, contented smile spread across my lips. His warmth surrounded me, his steady breathing a familiar rhythm. His hand traced gentle patterns on my arm, a quiet, soothing gesture that made me sigh in relaxation, savoring the peaceful start to the day. Dan always had a way of making me feel completely at ease. His actions were always thoughtful, steady, and reassuring. As I slowly woke, still drowsy, I allowed myself to lean into the comfort of his presence, appreciating the unspoken connection we had. These quiet moments, stolen away from the demands of the outside world, reminded me of how much I valued this time together. We stayed entangled until the alarm shattered the silence. He let out a heavy sigh before pulling away, slipping into the adjoining hotel room to get ready. This was our arrangement, discreet, necessary. Connected rooms ensured secrecy. If the truth came out, it would be a disaster. I wasn't just Dan's assistant, I was his confidant, his partner in ways no one suspected. For over 2 years, we had worked side by side, and for most of that time, we had been lovers. My role required frequent travel, conferences, meetings, networking events, offering endless opportunities to be together under the guise of business. No one questioned it. But the biggest problem? I had a husband, Alan. He worked from home, making it easier to hide things. Our marriage, though, had been over long before Dan. Alan and I had been together since high school, a relationship born from youthful naivete. One impulsive night while my parents were away changed everything. I got pregnant. By the time we told our families, our future was already decided. My parents pushed for infanticide. His insisted we keep the baby, offering to help. Alan never hesitated. He stood by me through the judgment, the stares, the whispered gossip. Pregnancy at 16 was brutal. After hours of excruciating labor, I held our daughter, Lauren, and knew I couldn't give her up. But my parents saw it differently. They cut me off, ashamed of my choices. With no other option, Alan and I moved in with his parents, two teenagers trying to raise a child while still growing up ourselves. His family kept their promise, helping us finish school, but life felt suffocating. There was no freedom, only responsibility. We married in a courthouse, no dress, no celebration, just another obligation. Soon after, another unplanned pregnancy brought our second daughter, Emma. Dreams of college disappeared. We worked endlessly to make ends meet, relying on his parents to help raise the girls. Alan was an incredible father, patient, loving, always present. But my relationship with our daughters was complicated. I loved them, yet deep inside, I resented them. They had stolen the future I once imagined, even if I knew it wasn't their fault. At 29, I landed a job as an assistant to Dan Johnson, a high-powered executive in a medical device company. He was confident, charismatic, and in control. From the start, we were an unstoppable team. Sales soared. Corporate took notice. And for the first time in years, I felt like more than just a wife and mother. I had purpose. The job demanded frequent travel, often with Dan. The thrill of new cities, high-stakes deals, late-night strategy sessions. It was electrifying. The downside? Days away from Alan and the girls. He managed things at home while I chased something I couldn't define. Dan and I became close. Too close. He was married, too, with kids of his own. But the more time we spent together, the blurrier the lines became. To keep Alan from suspecting, I lied. I made Dan seem insufferable, a boss I barely tolerated. The truth? He fascinated me. During business trips, we developed a pattern: intimate dinners, shared bottles of wine, lingering conversations. The attraction was undeniable, the affair inevitable. 6 months in, after sealing a major deal, we decided to celebrate. A quiet dinner, champagne. The tension between us was thick. Dan reached across the table, fingers grazing mine. His voice was calm, steady. "You know, Amy," he said, "I think I'm falling for you." My pulse quickened. His words hung in the air. I hesitated for only a second before taking his hand. That night, everything changed. Clothes hit the floor in a rush of urgency, restraint evaporating. It was reckless, desperate, intoxicating. And in the morning, we did it again, this time slow and deliberate. With our flight scheduled later, we ordered breakfast in bed, staying wrapped in each other. After eating, we gave in once more before heading to the airport. On the flight home, guilt crept in. I had crossed a line I could never uncross, lied, betrayed, but I justified it. I had never been with anyone but Alan. I had never known passion outside of duty. Maybe, in some twisted way, this was Alan's punishment for neglecting me. Then it hit me like a punch to the gut. I had forgotten Emma's birthday. She turned 11 yesterday, and I hadn't even called. I turned to Dan. He smiled at me, squeezing my hand reassuringly. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. I didn't want to stop. At home, the guilt was overwhelming. Alan greeted me with warmth, but I avoided his touch. That night, when he reached for me, I turned away. "I'm exhausted," I murmured. Truthfully, I was sore. From Dan. For the first time, I denied my husband. 18 months later, the affair hadn't burned out. Over time, I learned to bury my guilt, to lie effortlessly. The distance between Alan and me stretched wider, but I no longer cared. All I wanted was Dan. We crafted careful deceptions. If no trips were scheduled, we invented them. Fake meetings, fabricated conferences, discreet hotels. At work, we were meticulous. Separate arrivals, different lunch breaks, private emails. At home, I played my role, calling Alan at the same time each night, never revealing too much. "You're gone too often," Alan said one evening, frustration lacing his voice. "Why not find a job that keeps you home?" "They pay me too well," I responded smoothly. "I've worked too hard for this." It was my go-to excuse. At company events, we were even more careful. I introduced Alan to Dan with practiced indifference. Dan introduced his wife. Short conversations, polite smiles, forgettable interactions. In crowded rooms, we were strangers. No one suspected a thing. Alan was proud of my career but resented my absence. He carried the weight of parenting while managing his own job. I still cared about him in some way, but we had become distant. We had built a life together, our first child at 16, marriage at 18, another baby soon after. We had sacrificed, struggled, and at one point, loved deeply. But over time, I changed. Alan saw it before I did. The woman he married had faded, replaced by someone colder, more detached. I snapped easily, resented interruptions, withdrew from family life. Our closeness suffered. One night, he finally voiced it. "Is something wrong with us?" he asked quietly. "You're overthinking," I replied too quickly. "Work is just exhausting." "That's what you always say," he murmured, disappointment evident. I rolled over, pretending to be asleep.
At first, I trusted her completely. I convinced myself she was just exhausted. Too many late nights, too much pressure. But as time went on, the truth became impossible to ignore. Amy was slipping away from me. I tried to justify it. She had worked hard to build her career, and I respected that. I wanted to believe that was all it was. But the more distant she became, the longer she stayed away, the colder she acted, the more uneasy I felt. Physical affection became rare. When it did happen, it felt obligatory, empty. Anytime I tried to talk about it, she dismissed my concerns. "You're reading too much into things," she'd insist. "I'm doing this for us. Everything's fine." But it wasn't. By the end of her first year at the company, I attended their holiday party and finally met Dan, the boss she frequently complained about. He wasn't at all how she had described him. He was courteous, well-spoken, even charming. His wife was pleasant, and they seemed like any other couple. Amy, however, was visibly uneasy. She spoke quickly, her words rushed, an old habit of hers when she was nervous. She barely interacted with Dan, yet there was an unspoken tension between them. I told myself I was imagining things, but doubt had already crept in. The following year, I launched my own IT consulting business, balancing endless work hours while raising our daughters mostly on my own. Meanwhile, Amy's business trips became more frequent, her workdays stretched later, and she seemed more detached than ever. I told myself to be patient, that she was just focused on advancing her career. But I wasn't blind. The way she looked at me had changed, like I was a responsibility rather than a husband. Her words lacked warmth, sometimes even bordered on condescension. No matter how much I tried to hold on to her, she continued to drift further away, and I began to suspect work wasn't the real reason. Affection was scarce. When we were intimate, it felt more like a chore than an act of love. It was clear. Our marriage was coming apart at the seams. At the next Christmas party, I noticed it again, that same uncomfortable energy between Amy and Dan. Their interactions were stilted, overly polite, as if they were performing for an audience. This time, I couldn't push the suspicion aside. Was she hiding something? For the first time since we were teenagers, I found myself doubting her. Could she really be involved with someone else? The thought was unbearable. We had built so much together, sacrificed so much. She wouldn't throw it all away, would she? I didn't go through her emails or hire someone to follow her. Instead, I watched. I paid attention. I looked for anything that would confirm my worst fears. But I found nothing. Either I was being paranoid or she was exceptionally careful. Regardless, our marriage was falling apart. Meanwhile, our daughters were growing up fast. At 15, Lauren was stepping into young adulthood, and 12-year-old Emma wasn't far behind. The three of us spent a lot of time together. Their mother was hardly ever around. Both girls played soccer, and every Saturday, I was on the sidelines cheering them on. It became the highlight of my week. After every game, we had a standing tradition, dinner at their favorite Japanese restaurant where we talked about anything and everything except Amy. One Saturday, after a game, Emma ran over with another girl beside her. She was tall, athletic, strikingly beautiful, with long dark hair and warm brown eyes. "Dad, this is Callie. Can I go to her house today?" I smiled. "Nice to meet you, Callie. If your parents are okay with it, then sure." Callie turned and called out, "Mom, can Emma come over?" A woman approached, and the moment I saw her, my breath caught. She was the older reflection of her daughter, elegant, with the same dark hair and kind, intelligent eyes. She introduced herself as Sophie and welcomed Emma over. We exchanged pleasantries, though I barely remember what I said. I was too distracted, stumbling over my words like an awkward teenager. As they walked away, Lauren smirked. "Wow, Dad, that was painful to watch?" Emma giggled. "You totally embarrassed yourself." That evening, Emma came home beaming. "Dad, Sophie is amazing. She's been raising Callie and her little brother alone since their dad passed away in a car accident 3 years ago." Something about that stuck with me. A single mother, strong and independent, doing it all on her own. It hit closer to home than I cared to admit. The next Saturday, as Lauren and I stood on the sidelines watching Emma's game, Sophie and her son arrived and stopped beside us. "Mind if we stand here?" she asked. This time, I was ready. I wasn't going to make a fool of myself again. "Of course," I said with an easy smile. We chatted throughout the game. She had recently moved to the city for work and didn't know many people yet. She was relieved that Callie had found a friend in Emma. She even complimented me on how well-mannered my daughter was. After the game, Emma asked, "Can Callie come over today?" "Of course," I replied. "If Sophie doesn't mind." Sophie smiled. "Not at all. Me or Callie, though?" I chuckled. "Why not both? Do you like sushi?" Her eyes lit up. "I love sushi." Lauren jumped in. "You should come. It'd be nice to have someone new at the table. And finally, I'll have someone to talk to besides Dad and Emma." Sophie hesitated for a second before nodding. "If you're sure I wouldn't be intruding, then I'd love to." I tried to act casual, but Lauren shot me a knowing look. Lunch was a success. The girls talked nonstop while Sophie's son, Tom, seemed to enjoy my company. We bonded over soccer and technology. At one point, I overheard Sophie ask my daughters, "Does your mom ever come to your games?" Lauren didn't even hesitate. "No, never. She doesn't care about this stuff. She only cares about work. Dad is basically both our mom and dad. He's the one who takes care of us." Sophie glanced at me, something unreadable in her expression. Sympathy, maybe, or curiosity. A knot tightened in my chest. As the season went on, our post-game lunches became routine. Emma and Callie became inseparable, switching between each other's houses. Tom often tagged along, but more often than not, he gravitated toward me. We spent time fixing computers, kicking a soccer ball around, or riding bikes. Lauren also grew close to Sophie. They spent afternoons shopping, talking over coffee, sharing things they never seemed to share with Amy, or even with me. Sophie and I naturally fell into an easy rhythm. We were both practically single parents, supporting each other in ways we hadn't realized we needed. When soccer season ended, the kids found ways to keep busy on their own, leaving Sophie and me with open Saturday afternoons. We started filling them together. Walks on the beach, casual dinners, the occasional movie. It felt natural, comfortable. I looked forward to seeing her more than I wanted to admit. I knew where this was heading, but we never crossed a line. One afternoon, as we sat drinking coffee, I smiled at her. "Lauren never stops talking about you. She adores you." Sophie laughed. "Tom's the same with you. I think he really needed a strong male role model. Thank you for being there for him." She hesitated, then met my eyes. "I hope I'm not overstepping, but it's obvious things aren't good between you and Amy." Her words landed like a punch. Despite all the time Sophie and I had spent together, not once had we spoken about Amy. I sat there in silence, my fingers wrapped around the coffee cup, staring at the dark liquid inside. I had been running from the truth for years, but it had finally caught up with me. After a long pause, I exhaled. If it weren't for the girls, I probably would have walked away a long time ago. A bitter chuckle escaped me. Things weren't always this bad. Not perfect, but manageable. Now we barely say 2 words to each other. I've tried to reach her, but it's like talking to a wall. Sophie nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Lauren told me how you and Amy got married. She blames herself. She thinks that if she hadn't been born, you wouldn't be stuck in this marriage." I sighed, rubbing a hand over my face. I tell her all the time, it's not her fault. And then I couldn't stop. For the next hour, everything poured out of me. The frustration, the loneliness, the way Amy had become a stranger in our home, how I had convinced myself things would get better, only to watch them fall apart even more. Sophie listened quietly, never interrupting, just offering the kind of understanding I hadn't felt in years. When I finally stopped talking, she stood and wrapped her arms around me. "I'm here, Alan," she whispered. I held on tightly, realizing just how long it had been since someone had embraced me with genuine warmth. The months slipped by, and before I knew it, another Christmas had arrived, along with Amy's annual office party. I didn't want to go, but I forced myself. The usual pleasantries with Dan were the same, cordial, distant, unremarkable. But something felt different this time. I was paying attention. Amy and Dan were at ease with each other, too comfortable. There was no tension between them, no hesitation, just an unspoken familiarity that set off alarms in my gut. Later that night, Amy excused herself to use the restroom. A moment later, I watched as Dan casually made his way upstairs in the same direction. A chill crept down my spine. My pulse pounded as I followed, my mind racing. The bathroom was empty. My chest tightened as I moved through the dim hallway, searching. Then, through a slightly ajar bedroom door, I heard it. Amy's voice, soft, affectionate. "Merry Christmas, my dear." Dan's reply was just as intimate. "Merry Christmas, my love." My breath caught in my throat. With shaking hands, I nudged the door open just enough to see. There they were, wrapped in each other's arms, kissing. A wave of nausea hit me like a punch to the gut. My vision blurred, my body frozen in place. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Then, without a word, I turned and walked away, forcing myself to stay composed. What the hell do I do now? Rage burned inside me, but I refused to cause a scene. I needed evidence. I needed a plan. Minutes later, Amy returned to my side, slipping her arm through mine, smiling like the picture-perfect wife. I played along. For weeks, I pretended nothing had changed. When she slept, I hacked into her phone and laptop. She should have known better. Keeping secrets from an IT specialist was a terrible mistake. What I found shattered me. Emails, texts, photos, videos, a timeline of a 2-year affair. They had shared hotel rooms under the guise of work conferences. They had whispered about leaving their spouses. I read every message, saw every "I love you." My hands trembled as the full weight of it sank in. I installed tracking software on her devices, not because I needed more proof, but because I needed to stay ahead. I had to be strategic. Our marriage was already dead. Now, my focus was on my daughters. I needed to protect them. And before Amy could take half of everything I had built, I had to secure myself. On New Year's Day, I met with a divorce attorney. She explained that since I wasn't filing on the grounds of infidelity, Amy wouldn't face any legal consequences. But custody was a different matter. At 14, a child could decide which parent they wanted to live with. Emma would turn 14 in 6 months. I could wait. I could endure 6 more months under the same roof as Amy. The hardest part was pretending. When I told Sophie about the affair, I expected quiet support. Instead, she broke down in tears. "Sophie?" I asked, caught off guard. She wiped her face, struggling to steady her voice. "I'm sorry, it's just... my husband. When he died, he wasn't alone. His secretary was in the car with him." Shock hit me like a freight train. "What?" She nodded. "I found out afterward. He had been cheating on me for years. Losing him was hard enough, but learning the truth after the fact, that nearly broke me." Without thinking, I pulled her into my arms as she sobbed, understanding her pain far more than I ever wanted to. Once she calmed down, I explained my plan. I wouldn't leave Amy immediately. I had to wait for the right moment. Through her tears, Sophie managed a small, knowing smile. "You're doing the right thing." To prepare, I convinced Amy that we should sell the house and rent a bigger place while searching for our dream home. She agreed without hesitation. The house sold quickly, and I made sure the lease on our rental was only for 6 months. Sharing a bed with her made my skin crawl. The first night in the new house, I faked a cold and moved to the guest room. I never went back. She never asked. Maybe she didn't care. Then, I reached out to my father. I told him everything and asked for his help. Under his name, he started a new IT consulting business, with me as his sole employee. I shut down my company and funneled everything into his, shielding my assets before the divorce. Everything was falling into place. Until one afternoon, I walked into the house and found Lauren standing there, her face pale, fists clenched. My stomach twisted. "Lauren, what's wrong?" She hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Dad, Mom is having an affair with her boss." I kept my expression neutral. "What makes you think that?" Her arms crossed. "Emma and I went back to the old house to grab something. Mom and her boss were there." I frowned. "That's suspicious, but it doesn't mean..." She cut me off, her voice firm. "They weren't just talking, Dad. They were having sex, right there, on the living room floor." A slow breath escaped me, my fists tightening at my sides. My stomach churned. I stayed silent for a moment, then exhaled, forcing myself to stay steady. "Lauren, I've known for a while." Her eyes widened. "Then why haven't you done anything? Why are you letting her get away with it?" I hesitated. "Did Emma see?" Lauren nodded. "Yeah." I turned toward the doorway. "Emma." She stepped forward hesitantly. I opened my arms and she ran into me. Lauren joined a moment later, and I held them both close, my heart breaking. They had witnessed something no child should ever have to see. Looking them in the eyes, I asked, "Can you both keep a secret?" They nodded without hesitation. I took a deep breath. "I'm going to divorce your mother, but I need to wait until Emma turns 14. With you," they both said in unison, their voices unwavering. I smiled. "It won't be easy. We have to make sure she doesn't suspect anything." Lauren smirked. "We can handle that." From that moment on, we tolerated Amy's occasional presence, knowing it was only a matter of time before she was out of our lives for good. The girls and I found happiness in our time together, especially when she wasn't around. We also spent more time with Sophie and her kids, naturally blending into an unspoken family dynamic. One weekend, Amy claimed she was away for a work conference. But I knew better. She and Dan were at a festival together. That evening, Lauren casually mentioned, "Dad, I'm babysitting for Sophie tonight." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh? What's she up to?" "She has dinner plans at Brasserie Paris." A strange feeling settled in my chest. "With who?" Lauren smirked. "You, obviously. It's about time you had a real date." I blinked. "Wait, what?" She handed me my phone. "I already made the reservation. Now be an adult and call her properly." I hesitated. What if she doesn't see me that way? What if I make things weird? Lauren groaned. "How did you survive this long being this clueless? Just call her, Dad." Taking a deep breath, I dialed Sophie's number. She picked up almost immediately, her voice warm as if she had been expecting the call. She accepted without hesitation. That night, my daughters insisted on approving my outfit. It took 3 attempts before they were satisfied. Just as I was about to leave, Callie and Tom showed up. I raised an eyebrow. Lauren grinned. "They're staying over, so you don't have to rush home, or, come home at all." It was official. Our kids were plotting against us. When I arrived at Sophie's house, she opened the door, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. She wore a sleek black cocktail dress fitting her perfectly, her long dark hair cascading over one shoulder. She did a playful twirl. "Well, say something, Alan." I swallowed hard. I can't. You look incredible." Her eyes sparkled. "So, you like it?" I exhaled, my heart racing. "Sophie, I love it." Dinner was perfect. We laughed, talked for hours, and for the first time in years, I felt light, like a man truly enjoying himself again. At her doorstep, I hesitated. "I know the kids set this up so I'd stay over, but I don't want you to feel pressured." Sophie placed a finger against my lips, silencing me. "Shh. I want you to stay." She took my hand and led me inside, up the stairs, into her room. At first, we were hesitant, cautious, almost nervous. It had been so long since either of us had been with someone new. But as the night unfolded, we let go. Years of loneliness, frustration, and longing disappeared in the warmth of each other's arms. When it was over, I lay beside her, my heart pounding, utterly at peace. The next morning, we made love again. Slow, unhurried, savoring every moment. It felt natural. It felt right. Then came the inevitable interruption. Footsteps on the stairs, hushed voices, and a knock at the door. Lauren's teasing voice rang out. "Good morning, lovebirds. It's almost 10 and we're starving. Breakfast in 20 minutes. The door cracked open slightly, revealing her smirking face. "Oh, and I'd ask if you two had a good night, but judging by your faces, I already know the answer." With a laugh, she disappeared down the hall. Sophie sighed, shaking her head with a smile. "Our kids are unbelievable," I chuckled. "Completely impossible." Breakfast was perfect. Sitting around the table, laughing, sharing stories. It felt like family. Later that day, when I tried to explain to my daughters what had happened between Sophie and me, they didn't even let me finish. "Dad," Lauren said, exasperated, "you deserve to be happy. Mom checked out of this marriage years ago." Emma nodded in agreement. "Sophie is perfect for you. And besides, we need a mom, and Callie and Tom need a dad. It just makes sense." I stared at them. "Wait, this was your plan all along?" Lauren smirked. "Obviously." A few days later, over dinner, I casually mentioned I was house hunting. Sophie raised an eyebrow. "Oh? What kind of house?" I smiled. "Something by the beach. 2 stories. Big living space, a backyard with a pool, at least 6 bedrooms, just in case my family grows." I met her gaze, my heart pounding. "But before I commit, I need to be sure the woman I'm crazy about likes me back." Without hesitation, Sophie crossed the room and kissed me, deep, certain, leaving no doubt. When we finally pulled away, breathless, the kids sat in stunned silence, then erupted into cheers. That was all the confirmation I needed. Weeks of searching led us to the perfect place, a spacious 2-story home with an ocean view, plenty of room for everyone. We bought it together, using a mix of Sophie's late husband's estate and my share from selling my house. Our families were now officially one. There was only one thing left to handle: Amy. Emma's 14th birthday was around the corner, the moment I had been waiting for. Soon, I could make everything official. A few weeks before, Amy announced she'd be traveling for a work conference on the West Coast. That night, I checked her email. There was no conference. She and Dan had booked a trip to Bali, celebrating their 3rd anniversary. They had even coordinated fake alibis telling everyone they were visiting family to unwind from a tough year. Amy was set to fly out first, with Dan joining her the next day. They planned to return separately to maintain their cover. It was sloppy. Too many risks. Too many holes in their story. Almost laughable. While she thought she was heading off on a dream getaway, we moved out. Sophie and her kids had already settled into our new home. The girls and I packed our remaining belongings and never looked back. Then, fate stepped in. The night Amy landed in Bali, Mount Agung erupted. A massive volcanic explosion filled the sky with ash, grounding all flights indefinitely. Amy was stranded. And Dan? He was still at home, unable to reach her. I nearly choked from laughing as I read her frantic emails. She was furious, blaming Dan as if he had control over a volcano. Days turned into weeks, and the frustration between them grew. At home, I watched her desperation unfold purely for my own amusement. The angrier she got, the funnier it became. She'd occasionally call me, keeping up her elaborate lie. "Oh, Alan, the conference is going wonderfully," she'd say breezily. "So many great networking opportunities." I played along. "That's fantastic. How's the hotel? The city?" Later, I'd watch her frantically Google information to make sure her story held up. Meanwhile, our new family settled in effortlessly. The 6 of us, Sophie, her kids, my daughters, and me, had never been happier. While Amy remained stranded, I filed for legal separation. I also took matters into my own hands and secured temporary custody of the girls, using their written statements expressing their wish to stay with me. As her return date approached, flights were still grounded. That's when she called, her voice edged with nervousness. "I made some great contacts at the conference," she said quickly. "My boss wants me to stay a little longer for follow-ups." She was panicking. I grinned. "Of course, Amy. That makes perfect sense," she exhaled in relief. "Thanks, Alan." Amy remained stranded for another week, her frustration growing by the day. Dan covered for her at work, claiming she had extended her leave due to family obligations. He even had the audacity to call me, playing the concerned boss. "I'm really sorry to keep Amy away for so long," he said, "but this is a huge career opportunity for her." I nodded, feigning understanding. "Of course, Dan, I completely get it." Then casually I asked, "Where exactly did she say she was?" A brief pause. Then he rattled off vague details. Later I checked Amy's emails and found his exact instructions on what to say if I asked. They were so predictable. Each time Amy called, I pretended to be supportive while planting seeds of doubt. "Crazy situation in Bali, huh? Tons of people stranded because of the volcano." A short silence. "Oh, yeah, I haven't really followed the news." I smirked. "Funny, one of my colleagues is stuck there, Paul Howard. Remember him and his wife?" She hesitated. "Oh, right. He's been staying at the Grand Hyatt in Nusa Dua, handling work remotely." A sharp intake of breath. That was her hotel. Paul wasn't even in Bali, but she didn't know that. The moment we hung up, she panicked and moved to a cheap hotel across the island. Sophie and the kids found the whole thing hilarious. By now, her children felt like mine too. There was no doubt in my mind. After nearly 3 weeks, the ash cloud cleared and flights resumed. Amy called to announce her return. "I'll be home Friday afternoon." "Great," I said. I was waiting when she arrived. She walked in, setting her bags down carefully. I sat at the kitchen table with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses, watching her. She forced a smile. "Alan?" Her tan was deep, far too deep for someone on a business trip. I barely acknowledged her half-hearted kiss on the cheek. "Wow," I said, swirling my wine. "You got quite the tan. Did you manage to get any work done?" She muttered something, avoiding my gaze. I gestured to the chair across from me. "Sit. Have a drink." She hesitated. "Alan, I'm exhausted. I just want to shower and rest." "Sorry," I said firmly. "We need to talk. Now." She stiffened. Where are the girls? With friends, so we can have this conversation alone. Her face paled. She knew something was coming, but had no idea what. Slowly, she sat. I poured her a glass of wine, took a sip, and leaned back. You know, Amy, things between us haven't been right for a long time. I sighed, giving her an almost sympathetic look. You know why, don't you? She swallowed. No. I met her gaze. I won't sugarcoat it. I've met someone else. I love her, and I want to be with her. That's why I'm leaving you. Her face twisted in shock, then fury. I didn't plan this, I continued, voice calm. But you've been distant for so long. I was lonely. How dare you, she snapped. After everything I've done for you? She launched into a tirade. Accusations, outrage, venomous words. I let her vent, watching silently. When she finally stopped, I stood. I get that you're upset. There's no point in continuing this right now. I'll be back tomorrow at noon. We have a lot to sort out. I walked out, leaving her seething. Predictably, my phone exploded with furious texts and voicemails. I ignored them all. At home, Sophie and the kids were waiting. How'd it go? She asked. I grinned. Better than expected. We ordered pizza, watched a movie, and laughed together. The girls turned off their phones, unwilling to deal with their mother. That night, I held Sophie close, making love to her slowly, tenderly. For the first time in years, I felt nothing but peace. Who was Amy? The next day, I arrived at my old house with a folder of documents. Amy was waiting, fuming with Claire, her best friend and lawyer. I knew from Amy's old emails that Claire had encouraged her affair, feeding her justifications, assuring her she deserved some fun. As soon as I sat down, Claire pounced. Alan, you're making a huge mistake. Amy is a devoted wife and mother. You're throwing everything away over some midlife crisis. I leaned back, unmoved. And if I don't? Claire's eyes narrowed. Then Amy will take you to court. She'll fight for everything. Your money, the house, the girls. You'll be left with nothing. I almost laughed. If only she knew. Amy crossed her arms. How could you do this to me? I met her gaze. Amy, I know this is painful, but honestly, I'm surprised you're this upset. It's been a long time since you've acted like you cared. She scoffed. That's ridiculous. I worked hard for this family. I leaned forward. Then tell me, when was the last time we made love? Silence. I can tell you, I said. 3 years ago. Her face darkened. That's not true. Zex. Sure. Love? No. There's a difference. I exhaled. I even know when it started. 3 years ago, when you forgot to call Emma on her 11th birthday. She waited all day for you to call. She was heartbroken. Amy's expression flickered. You did it again 2 weeks ago, I continued. Her 14th birthday. No call, no message, nothing. Claire shifted, uncomfortable. Amy's hands clenched in her lap. I had hit my mark. For years, we've been strangers under the same roof. We don't sleep in the same bed. We don't spend time together. We barely speak. Can you even remember the last time we went out as a family? Amy stared at the table. I sighed. I'm moving on. I hope we can make this divorce easy for the girls. Her voice was quiet. Who is she? I met her eyes. You know her daughter, Callie. Amy's face went pale. You've met her mother, Sophie, at soccer games. We became friends and it grew into something more. I love her. We're building a life together. Amy looked stunned. Claire sat in disbelief for once without a snide remark. Before they could speak, I slid the thick folder across the table. Here's how this plays out, I said, flipping it open. Tab A, our legal separation filed 2 weeks ago. Tab B, our divorce petition. The sooner you sign, the sooner this is over. Tab C, our financial settlement. Tab D, the lease for this house, which expires in 3 weeks. If you want to stay, renew it in your name. Tab E, utility contracts. I've already canceled mine. If you're staying, you'll need to handle them yourself. I turned to the last section. Tab F, a court order granting me full custody. The girls have chosen to live with me. Child support will be deducted from your paycheck. Visitation can be arranged. Silence. Amy stared at the documents, her face ashen. Claire, on the other hand, was livid. You conniving fool, she spat, slamming her palm against the table. You've been planning this for months, haven't you? I met her glare, completely unfazed. Since Christmas? Claire's expression darkened. You won't get away with this. We'll take everything. Your money, your business, your kids. You'll end up with nothing. I chuckled, shaking my head. Claire, you can't take what doesn't exist. My company shut down months ago. I work for someone else now. The house Sophie and I bought, purchased after I filed for separation, Legally, it's not a marital asset. My savings? I reinvested most of the money from selling our old home into my new life, completely above board, given that I have full custody. Claire's jaw tightened, but she had nothing to counter with. I turned back to Amy. By the way, the state law allows children over 14 to decide which parent they want to live with. They chose me. Her expression twisted with pain. You turned them against me. I shook my head. I didn't have to. You did that all on your own. Claire scoffed. Amy is a good mother. I exhaled, leaning forward. Then answer this. Who feeds them? Who takes them to their games? Who helps with homework? Who remembers their birthdays? Who actually spends time with them? Amy lowered her gaze, silent. After a long pause, I softened my tone. The girls asked me to invite you to breakfast tomorrow at 10, by the beach. It was my idea, not theirs. They weren't particularly interested. Amy opened her mouth as if to say something, but no words came. She just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. I gathered my things and walked out, leaving them both sitting there in stunned silence. The next day, when the girls returned from breakfast, their disappointment was evident. Lauren sighed, dropping into a chair. She spent the whole time complaining about you. Emma nodded. She told us we should be living with her. I expected nothing less. Did she ask about your lives? How you've been doing? Emma shook her head. Nope. It was all about her. They eventually excused themselves to the restroom, then simply walked out, leaving Amy sitting there alone. I wasn't surprised. She had never really cared about rebuilding her relationship with them. She only cared about maintaining control. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized Amy never wanted me back. She just never thought I'd actually leave.
Alan's announcement hit me like a punch to the gut. He was leaving me for another woman. I stood there speechless, unable to process his words. How could he? Hadn't he loved me? Hadn't we built a life together? Desperate, I tried to talk to him, to salvage what was left, but he shut me down without hesitation. He was done. Our only interactions were the brief moments we exchanged the kids, and even then, he barely acknowledged me. My daughters made it clear where they stood. Every visit was strained, filled with icy silence and unspoken resentment. When I dropped them off, they would rush into Sophie's embrace, as if to remind me how easily I had been replaced. The pain was unbearable. Eventually, I told them not to come back until they wanted to. They didn't. I had assumed life would continue as usual, Alan managing the house while I kept things going with Dan. But when Alan walked away, the illusion shattered. At first, I was furious. The betrayal burned. But as time passed, a brutal truth set in. I should have seen it coming. Alan wasn't wrong. I had abandoned him long before he left me. For years, I had poured all my energy, love, and attention into Dan, leaving nothing for my husband. I had convinced myself Alan would always be there, waiting. The real shock wasn't that he left. It was that he stayed as long as he did. And now? I had nothing. I couldn't afford rent and child support at the same time, so I downsized to a tiny, depressing apartment. The silence was suffocating. No family, no daughters, just me, takeout containers, and a TV I barely watched. Then, something else changed. Dan. Suddenly he was too busy. Even though I was free now, he sent me on business trips alone. You can handle clients solo now, he said, flashing a hollow smile. Our time together became empty. The passion faded, replaced by something mechanical, detached. It wasn't love anymore, just routine. 6 months after my divorce, Dan called me into his office. I took a job with another firm, he said casually. I'll be moving soon. I stared at him. And us? He sighed. Amy, I need to focus on my career. It's for the best. Just like that, he was gone. I never heard from him again. That was when it truly hit me. I had lost everything. I had wanted it all. A husband who took care of me and a lover who excited me. I thought Alan would always be there, waiting in the background. I was wrong. A line from an old Joni Mitchell song kept running through my mind. You don't know what you've got till it's gone. And the worst part? I couldn't even bring myself to hate Sophie. She was kind, beautiful, and good to my daughters. Alan wasn't just with her. He was happy. That realization hurt more than anything. For the first time in years, I really looked at Alan, the man I had once loved, the man who had stood by me through every struggle, every sacrifice. the man who had fought for our marriage, until he didn't. He looked like the person I had fallen for all those years ago, back when we were just kids, navigating life together. How had I let it all slip away? My daughters were thriving too, happier than I had seen them in years. And me? I was an afterthought, a visitor in their lives. They saw Sophie as their mother now. One night, I broke down in front of them, crying, spilling out my regrets like a desperate child. Lauren's face was unreadable as she watched me. Then, coldly, she said, "You did this to yourself, Mom. You threw Dad away." I wiped my tears, my voice shaking. "I know I wasn't perfect. I know I neglected all of you. But he's the one who left me." Lauren's expression hardened. "Mom, he left because you had an affair with your boss for 3 years." I froze. My breath caught. She knew. The shame hit me like a tidal wave. Alan had known all along. He had never confronted me, never humiliated me. He had just walked away. And my daughters, they had seen through me the entire time. All this time, I had convinced myself I was the sufferer. But I wasn't. I had wrecked my own life. I had destroyed my marriage. I had pushed my daughters away. And yet, Alan never turned them against me. Even after everything, he encouraged them to stay in touch, to give me a chance. It took time, but eventually they did. Little by little, they started visiting again. Some nights, they even stayed over. One evening, after dropping my daughters off, I hesitated before leaving. Taking a deep breath, I turned to Alan. "Can we talk?" He studied me for a moment before nodding and stepping away from the car. I swallowed hard, my voice unsteady. "Lauren told me you knew about Dan." I looked down. "I'm sorry, Alan. You were a good husband. You didn't deserve that. I was selfish, and now I'm facing the consequences." He remained silent, only nodding. I hesitated before whispering, "Why didn't you confront me? Maybe I could have stopped." Alan exhaled, crossing his arms. "By the time I knew, it was already too late." Dread pooled in my stomach. "When did you find out?" His voice was calm, almost indifferent. "The office Christmas party last year. I saw you sneak off with him. After that, I started digging. That's when I uncovered everything." Heat rushed to my face. My hands clenched. I had no idea." A dry chuckle escaped him. "Honestly, watching you stranded in Bali alone was strangely satisfying." I groaned, covering my face. "That was a disaster. You must have hated me." His expression softened. "I was angry, Amy. But then I realized Dan had done this before, gone through assistance like a revolving door. I figured if I stayed quiet, he'd eventually move on. And that's exactly what happened, right?" I swallowed hard and nodded. "Yeah, you were right." He shrugged. "I thought letting you believe I left for another woman would hurt more. Turns out I didn't need to do anything. You destroyed it yourself." A shaky breath left me. "You got your revenge, Alan." He shook his head. "It was never about revenge. I just needed to move on." My chest tightened. "My life's a mess, and I regret hurting you." Alan gave a small, sad smile. "I appreciate that, but honestly, I don't regret how things turned out. If you hadn't cheated, I wouldn't have found Sophie." That hurt more than I expected. I forced a smile. "Yeah, I get it. And that's what stings the most." He sighed. "Amy, we were kids who got trapped in a grown-up life too soon. You made a mistake, but I also know you never got to figure out who you really were. And Dan took advantage of that." Tears burned my eyes. "Maybe you're right." After a pause, I added, "But telling the girls? That was cruel." Alan frowned. "I didn't tell them, Amy. They told me." My body went cold. "What?" He sighed, shaking his head. "They walked in on you two right after we moved out of the old house." I gasped. The memory hit me like a truck. That afternoon, Dan and I lost in the moment, never expecting anyone to show up. My voice trembled. "What did they see?" His jaw clenched. "Everything." A shudder ran through me. "Even Emma?" He nodded. "Lauren gave me every detail." Something inside me broke. My knees buckled, and before I knew it, I was sobbing. Alan caught me before I collapsed, his arms steady, his scent strangely familiar, making the pain worse. I don't know how long I cried, but eventually I was inside, curled up on the couch. When I opened my eyes, Sophie was there, concern written all over her face. To my surprise, she wasn't smug or condescending. She was kind. She sat beside me, offering quiet comfort, and when I finally pulled myself together, she invited me to stay for dinner. Sitting at the table with Alan, my daughters, and Sophie's kids, I saw it. Alan was truly happy. The kind of happiness I had once taken for granted. And now, it was gone. Later that night, as I walked to my car, Alan followed me. Just as I reached for the door, I felt his hands gently rest on my shoulders. "Amy," he said softly, "stop punishing yourself. You've been miserable long enough." I swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. He sighed. "We were too young when this all started. The fact that we lasted 14 years is actually kind of amazing." He gave me a faint smile. "That's something to be proud of." Tears welled in my eyes. He was right. He gave my shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "And hey, our 2 mistakes turned into incredible daughters. No matter what happened, we did that together." I nodded, forcing a smile. "You're right." He hesitated. "Speaking of mistakes, I made another one." I frowned. "What?" "Sophie's pregnant. That's why we're getting married sooner than planned." A sharp sting hit my chest, but I masked it with a smirk. "You really don't learn, do you?" He laughed. "Guess not." I exhaled, looking at the man I had once loved. "You were a good husband, Alan. Better than I ever deserved." His eyes softened. "Thank you, Amy." I stepped forward and hugged him, pressing a light kiss to his cheek. "I wish you all the happiness in the world." Then, without another word, I got in my car and drove away. As I left, a bittersweet thought settled in my mind. Alan had found his happiness. Maybe someday I'd find mine too.
Why didn't I hold on to the anger? Part of me knew that resentment was a losing battle. Holding on to it would only weigh me down, turning me into someone just as bitter and hollow as she had become. Hatred is exhausting. It eats at you, poisons your mind, and leaves nothing but emptiness in its wake. Letting go wasn't about kindness. It was about self-preservation. Besides, Amy was already suffering in ways that required no effort from me. Every time she saw me with Sophie, every time she watched her daughters light up around another woman, she felt the sting of her own choices. That was punishment enough. But my real revenge? That was never meant for Amy. It was meant for Dan. He was the one who lured my wife away, the one who encouraged her to discard our family like an afterthought. He thought he had won. He had no idea what was coming. I had gained access to his computer, masking my intrusion as a harmless email from Amy. The moment he clicked on it, a hidden Trojan activated, granting me full access to his files. And what I found was beautiful. Dan had a history of stealing, embezzling funds from his previous job, and actively siphoning money from his current employer. He had been careful, meticulous even, but not enough. Within hours, I had compiled a rock-solid case, gathering every damning document, every wire transfer, every fraudulent transaction. Then, I sent it all, anonymously, to the authorities and his company's higher-ups. The legal system didn't waste time. Faced with overwhelming evidence, he had no choice but to plead guilty. The judge handed down a 7-year sentence. During the trial, his wife stood by him, bringing their children to visit, trying to keep their family intact. That changed the moment I decided to pay her a visit. I had come prepared. Not only did I have proof of his affair with Amy, but I also had evidence of every other woman he had been with over the years. Emails, hotel receipts, pictures, messages. When I showed her, the fury in her eyes was immediate. "I'm done," she seethed. "He'll never see me or the kids again." Perfect. But I wasn't finished. One afternoon, I took a trip to the prison to see him face to face. When he spotted me across the visiting room, confusion flickered in his eyes before it hardened into a glare. "What the hell are you doing here?" he spat. I took my time before answering, enjoying the moment. "Just delivering a few messages. First, from Amy." His scowl wavered slightly. "She hopes you're settling in," I continued, a smirk tugging at my lips. "I personally helped arrange your stay here." His hands clenched into fists. "What the hell does that mean?" I leaned forward, lowering my voice. "You really should have invested in better security." The moment I got into your system, it took me all of 15 minutes to find everything. Embezzlement, fraud, stolen funds. You practically handed it to me on a silver platter. I shrugged. All I had to do was forward it to the right people. His face turned crimson, his whole body tensing. He started shouting, cursing, threatening, but I remained unmoved, watching as his rage boiled over. When he finally stopped, breathing hard, I smiled. Oh, and one more thing. I had a chat with your wife. The color drained from his face. She wasn't too happy to learn about all your little side adventures, I continued, feigning sympathy. I even helped her with the paperwork. The divorce should be finalized soon. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small envelope, placing it on the table between us. Go ahead, I said. Take a look. He hesitated before ripping it open. Inside were several intimate photographs of me and his wife in various compromising positions, except they weren't real. Photoshop had done all the heavy lifting. But he didn't know that. His entire body went rigid, his jaw tightening so hard I thought his teeth might crack. She wanted me to pass along a message, I added casually. She's done with you. No more visits, no more calls, no more letters. Your kids, they won't be coming back either. If you ever get out of here, you'll have nothing left. He looked at me, truly looked at me, and in that moment, I saw it. The exact second he realized he had lost everything. I stood, straightened my jacket, and turned toward the door. As I walked away, I couldn't help but think, whoever said revenge is best served cold was absolutely right.